Every kind of religion has its own brand of shame. But are you ready for some good news? There is a cure for the hardening of the arteries, and it is the grace of God. To adapt the title of the old country music hit, I've been in every church, man. I feel like I've been in every kind of church. It sure seems like it. I grew up in the liturgical church. I grew up in my faith in a conservative Bible church. I trained for ministry in a liberal mainline church, and I found power in the charismatic churches. And every tradition has brought some sort of blessing in my life. And I must also report, every tradition has doled out its fair dose of shame. So liberal churches might tell you, you ought to be more accepting of others. They can be really judgmental of people that are too judgmental. Conservative churches might tell you, you ought to have more conviction. Try harder. Liturgical churches might tell you, you ought to have more order in your life. Charismatic churches might tell you, you ought to have more freedom. With all the ought tos, as my spiritual father Dudley Hall says, it's enough to give you the hardening of the arteries. You know, why did people flock to Jesus? I've come to one simple conclusion. He wasn't at all like the other religious leaders of his day. He was a rabbi, a religious leader and healer, but he didn't make people feel worse about themselves ever. There was something so approachable about Jesus that even the worst, quote, sinners felt safe to approach him. He said some very narrow things, pointing to one way, one truth, and one life in himself. Yet no one ever felt shamed or condemned by his demeanor, unless it was the tyrannical super legalist who oppressed the people in the name of God. But the sinners loved thronging about him. People have always loved and longed for eternal truth, mystery, and power, but they've been willing to forfeit their spiritual search for the sake of avoiding shame. The first time in Jesus Christ, truth, mystery, and power became available without shame. When the truth is presented in perfect grace, myriads will flock to behold it. Jesus Christ was full of grace and full of truth. He wasn't 50% truth and 50% grace. He wasn't sometimes gracious and sometimes truthful. He was 100% grace and 100% truth all the time. If the message of the gospel is in any way clouded by a message of shame, then people will avoid church at all costs. If, however, there's a church that proclaims eternal truth and mystery in the context of utter love and acceptance, that church will find the world at its door. Jesus didn't bring a religious message of what people ought to do. Jesus came with a message of salvation for those who could never fulfill enough ought tos. Jesus did what you ought to have done, but couldn't. And that's the gospel. That's today's good news. You can get more videos like it by clicking right here. Learn a lot more about shame and its healing in the gospel. If you haven't done so, be sure and subscribe to this channel. Tell others about it so you can start out every day with good news.